that's where she is.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Book Sandwiched In again. And today, Gary Emerson will be reviewing The Shoemaker and the Tea Party. Gary grew up in Elmira and was a history teacher for 36 years. He lives in Odessa now and is now the Schuyler County Historian. He's also a PhD. He's also a PhD candidate at Binghamton University in the field of American history. So without further delay, Gary Emerson.
All right, thank you. So, The Shoemaker and the Tea Party by Al Young, and the subtitle is Memory and the American Revolution. And this came out in 1999. So, this is a book about history and memory and the strained relationship between the two. History tries to be objective, it tries to seek the truth, but memory tends to be subjective. Memory is something that's created. And the problem is that history relies on memory, but memory's flawed and it changes. So people tend to remember what they want to remember. And part of remembering, part of memory is forgetting. It's important to realize that things get forgotten to create that memory as well. We choose to forget certain things when we create our memories. For example, the lost cause after the Civil War claimed that the war was not about slavery. The South didn't secede because of slavery, they seceded because of their rights, states' rights. Well, today most historians say, well, it was definitely about slavery, it wasn't about states' rights. Or, to pick something even more recent, the January 6th insurrection, the Capitol. Some people say, well, they were just like tourists going through the building, taking pictures. And other things tend to indicate that it was quite different than that. People were being killed in some cases. So, in this book, Al Young explains how a man, an ordinary shoemaker, who participated in the American Revolution, rose from obscurity to fame, and from being forgotten to being remembered, and then going back to being forgotten again. Young raises the question, how does an ordinary person win a place in history? He says it has a lot to do with the values of those who are telling the history, the keepers of the past. It's been said that the past never changes, but history does. And that's because history relies on memory, and memory changes over time. And, years ago, for example, there was no women's history. If you picked up a history textbook, and there was nothing in there, there was no chapter called Women in the American Revolution. That wasn't even talked about. And African American history, same deal. They're not really discussed much in the past. It was not to the 1960s and 70s when you see a rise of social history that starts looking at history from the bottom up and considering people who were forgotten in history and using other sources to learn more about their participation in history, that we start to see more things like women's history and African American history. And Young says that doing history is about asking the right questions as well. And he raises several questions in the book that he tries to answer. For example, what role did a common person like Hewes play in the Revolution? What did the Revolution mean to him and other common people like him? When did the destruction of the tea become known as the Boston Tea Party? Because it wasn't originally known as that. It was called the destruction of the tea, and nobody called it the Boston Tea Party for almost 50 years after the war. Young divides his book into two parts. In part one, he examines the life of George Robert 12 Hewes and who he was. And in part two, Young explains how the memory of the Revolution changed and became a contested memory. So in part one, he delves into the background of George Robert 12 Hewes. And that's kind of a funny name, that he has the name 12 as part of his name. And that was a family tradition. Apparently he had an ancestor, his name included 5 as part of his name. So it's kind of a family thing. In fact, George and his wife had many children, and he named one son George Robert 15 Hewes. So he carried on the tradition. And let's see. Here's a painting of Hewes that hangs in the old State House in Boston. And from looking at this painting, you wouldn't know that he was a shoemaker, unlike the famous portrait of Paul Revere. Whoops, I don't have it here right now. We'll see that one later, I guess. But when you see the painting of Paul Revere, it's very clear that he was a silversmith, because it shows him doing his craft in the painting. But Hewes isn't depicted that way. This painting is called the Centenarian, because they thought Hewes, when they did this painting, they thought he was 98 years old. He wasn't. He was actually 93. He was a little younger than that. But they thought he was almost 100 years old, so the painting gets called the Centenarian. And Young notes that in those days, where one ended up in life really depended on where one started out in life. Hewes' father was a candle maker and a tanner. And he was not a wealthy man. And when he died when Hewes was 14 years old, Hewes had to be apprenticed to go learn a craft so he could make a living for himself. And he became a shoemaker, or also known as a cordwainer. He made and repaired shoes. Hewes got remembered because he lived a long time. And so he ends up giving his version of things that happened when he gets celebrated later on, 50 years after the Revolution. Much like Joshua Chamberlain, for example, at Gettysburg. Chamberlain is known as the hero of Little Round Top, but he largely became the hero because he lived a long time. He outlived everybody else, so he got to tell the story of what happened at Little Round Top. So there are others who claim that it didn't quite happen exactly the way he depicted it. So in old age, in the 1830s, Hewes gets discovered by two writers who wrote biographies about him. And those men were Benjamin Thatcher and James Hawkes. And those biographies are largely based on Hewes' memory, which actually was quite good. He had a very good memory for a guy his age. Sometimes he got some things wrong, as we'll see, but he remembered things very well. And Young's able to determine that because by looking at other sources, he could determine that what Young was remembering was correct. And Hewes actually played a role in some rather important events in the Revolution. For example, he was at the Boston Massacre in 1770, because he lived in Boston. Boston citizens didn't always get along with the soldiers in Boston. One thing they didn't like about them was the soldiers in their off hours often took jobs. And that meant fewer jobs for Bostonians when they did that. Excuse me, one of the things they would do often was they worked making rope near the harbor. And Boston citizens objected to the soldiers taking their jobs from them. Also, the British soldiers sometimes ripped them off on things. For example, Hewes got ripped off. He made some shoes for an officer, and the soldier who got the job for him refused to pay him after he did the work. And so Hewes turned him in, complained, and that soldier got 300 lashes with a whip as his punishment. Hewes was appalled. Hewes was a very kind soul. And he was appalled that this soldier was treated that way. He said, I wished I'd never turned him in if I'd known that was going to happen. But that's what happened to him. But in any event, the citizens had this confrontation with these soldiers. They were shouting at them. And the soldiers were afraid for their lives. They fired into the crowd, and some Bostonians were killed as a result of it. The man standing right next to Hewes was shot and killed, and as he fell, Hewes caught him. And the Boston Massacre, Young writes, has really stirred Hewes to action, to political action. It was a key event in his life, and he became more involved in events in Boston and politics. Another event he was at, of course, is the destruction of the tea, thus the Shoemaker and the Tea Party. On December 16, 1773, was the Boston Tea Party. And the tea tax angered Americans, but what a lot of people don't realize is one reason Americans were angry about the tea tax is because there was some tea that did not have a tax on it. The British East India Company was given an exemption because they had this huge amount of tea they couldn't unload, so they were exempt from the tea tax. Other colonial merchants who imported tea from other places had to pay the tax, so they're mad because the British East India Company could outsell them, and it's hurting their business. So they're mad about this tea tax. So men dressed as Indians daubed their faces and hands with coal dust to disguise themselves and wore Indian costumes and went down to the harbor and went onto ships. Hewes was chosen to serve as an officer during the Tea Party. On the ship he was on, he was told to go ask the captain for the keys to the hold so they could get the tea out. and then they broke open the boxes of tea and dumped them into the harbor. And Hewes's memory is that standing next to him dumping the tea was John Hancock, because this man was kind of wealthy looking. He had a very expensive looking shirt on and stuff. And Hewes had met John Hancock before, as we'll talk about in a little bit, but the fact of the matter is John Hancock was not there. So this is one thing that Hewes did remember incorrectly, but he recalled that John Hancock and he were both dumping tea over the side of the ship. Another incident that Hewes was involved with was a tarring and feathering incident. Tarring and feathering was a way of punishing people that you didn't like. And there's two ways to get tarred and feathered: clothes on or clothes off. Clothes on was called being gently tarred and feathered, because you could take the clothing off and get rid of a lot of the tarring and feathering. And that tar's hot. And so this gentleman by the name of John Malcolm was kind of a wealthy gentleman living in Boston, and he was a rather obnoxious Tory that most people in the community didn't like very much. And Hewes came across him confronting this young boy, and the boy was like cowering on the ground, and Malcolm standing over him with his cane with a big heavy head on the top of the cane, and he's threatening to hit this boy with it. And Hewes was afraid if he hits that boy, he's going to kill him. So he intervened, and Malcolm objected to his interference in this. And in fact, Malcolm told Hewes that Hewes was a poor, that he was a vagabond and a rascal. And Hewes responded, well, maybe I'm poor, but I'm not a vagabond or a rascal. I pay my debts, you know, I pay my way, I make my own living. And then he told Malcolm, well, at least, because Malcolm had once been tarred and feathered gently by a mob that didn't like him because he was a Tory. And Hewes told Malcolm, well, at least I was never tarred and feathered. Well, that didn't sit very well with Mr. Malcolm, and he took his cane and he smashed it right into the forehead of George Hewes, knocked him unconscious. And they had to take him to a doctor. And the doctor said, thank God you have a thick skull, because it saved your life. But Hewes is appalled again when the mob goes to Malcolm's house, drags him out, and confronts him. And he had weapons in his hand, and they mentioned again about his being tarred and feathered, and they're threatening to do it again. And he made the mistake of saying, well, I don't think you can do a better job of it. Well, they did. They disarmed him, grabbed him, took him down to King Street, and tarred him and feathered him, not gently this time either. So he kind of learned his lesson. The next time, several weeks later, Hewes was walking down the street and he ran into Malcolm. He said to him, how do you do, Mr. Malcolm? And Malcolm replied politely, your humble servant, Mr. George Robert 12 Hewes, and he tipped his hat to him. So apparently he didn't want to get tarred and feathered again. During the war, Hewes served short stints in the militia and also served in a couple voyages at sea on a privateer. And so they were capturing British ships, and then they would divide the money they earned from it. And at sea, he found out that the captains really needed the crew to vote on decisions, that the captain had to defer to the crew. So it was a little bit democratic. And if the captain wanted the crew to do something, they would vote on it and decide whether to do it or not. Also during the war, George Hewes met George Washington, General Washington, in 1775. Washington's army was laying siege to Boston. He needed information about what's going on in the city. So Hewes sat down with Washington, had dinner with him, had a glass of punch with him, and told him all about what's going on in Boston. So here's the great George Washington sitting down with this shoemaker, George Hewes. And Young claims that Hewes' participation in these events is what made Hewes a citizen. He saw himself as equal. He did not have to show deference nor take his hat off to anyone. This is an age of deference. You were expected to be deferential to your betters. And Hewes once had to visit John Hancock when he did some work for him. Hancock invited him over on New Year's Day to pay his respects. So Hewes knocked on his door, and when the door was answered, Hewes had his hat in his hand, and he met with Hancock, and he brought him in, and they sat out somewhere in the house, and they had a glass of alcohol to drink, and it was like he was showing his deference to Hancock. This is the kind of stuff that was. But Hewes' memory of destroying tea next to Hancock kind of brought Hancock down to Hewes' level, that they were equal. And his confrontation with Malcolm showed how Hewes expected him to be treated with respect. And the revolution kind of lets the genie out of the bottle, so to speak. Ordinary people came to expect more say and to have their grievances addressed. They wanted more democracy, more equality. And Young notes, the revolution was not a plebeian revolution, but there was a powerful plebeian current within it. Elites had to make concessions to the ordinary people to keep their support. So we learn about the revolution being a war over people claiming no taxation without representation and other ideological reasons. In fact, a gentleman named Bernard Balin once wrote a book called The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. And he claimed that what really spawned the revolution was people's belief in Whig ideology. And this taught that people must guard against power becoming too centralized, for it would deny liberty. So you don't want a strong central government. You need a balanced government with a king, aristocracy, and democracy. You've got to have all three of those things present so that power is balanced. And you need limits on power because power corrupts. And people must have representation in order to prevent abuse of power, like too much taxation. But the reality is that different groups had different reasons for fighting the revolution. They had their own grievances. People on the frontier, for example, simply wanted protection against Indian attacks. They weren't thinking about Whig ideology. And for Hewes, a member of the laboring class, it's about being treated more respectfully and as an equal. This is a quote that Young wrote in his book about how Hewes understood the revolution. Young wrote, "The war left a memory of rights asserted and rights respected. It was a memory, above all, of respect from his betters, from General Washington at Cambridge, from Captain Stacy and Smedley at sea, as from John Hancock in Boston. For a moment had been a world that marched to the tune of the old English nursery rhymes supposedly played at Cornwallis' surrender. The world turned upside down." So here was an ordinary shoemaker who was asserting his equality with John Malcolm, said he threw tea overboard with John Hancock, dined with George Washington. So to him, it's about an assertion of his equality and about being a citizen. After the war, Hewes goes back to being a shoemaker again. He eventually moves to Richfield Springs, New York, near Cooperstown. And he lived with various members of his family, his children, and he kind of became forgotten about. And he still worked as that shoemaker. And he wasn't really wealthy, and he just moved from home to home with his children. And that concludes part one of his book. So part two, he gets into the memory of the revolution. And he talks about, in the years after the revolution, the heroes who were celebrated were the elites. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams. Those are the people that really were celebrated as being the heroes of the revolution. More radical leaders like Sam Adams were forgotten and ignored. John Hancock's house was torn down in 1863. They didn't think it was important enough to even keep preserved. So for a century after the revolution, there was kind of a willful forgetting about some figures and some aspects of the revolution. And after the revolution, into the early 19th century, there were not a lot of schools. There were very few textbooks to spread the public memory of the revolution. And history was not really a subject that was taught in schools much. So news spread very slowly. There weren't a lot of newspapers. How did people get their memory of the revolution? Well, they got it from sermons at church, from speeches given on public holidays, even from the theater, the plays that were put on. And those were all controlled by elites who protected a rather conservative memory of the revolution. 50 years after the revolution, many of the veterans are disappearing. The revolution moves from a collective memory, which is one held by those who experienced it, to a historical memory, one created by a new generation that had not lived through it. They had to decide how they would remember the revolution. Frequently, historical memory is more about the present than the past. People create a memory that justifies the present, and that creation is done through a dialectic of remembering and forgetting. So by the 1820s, 1830s, America's in the age of Jackson. There's a greater sense of equality, democracy. They're celebrating the common man. It's the end of property requirements for voting and universal white male suffrage. It's also the rise of capitalism. You're seeing all these factories arise. Men are working for wages in factories. A radical worker movement arises with unions being formed. It's also the rise of the abolitionist movement going on, trying to outlaw slavery. You have the women's movement get started where they're agitating for the right to suffrage. So a lot of radical movements get started at this time period. It's also the time when we see the rise of print culture. With the invention of steam-powered printing presses, they're able to crank out a lot more and cheaper books and newspapers and magazines. And you start to see, finally, the rise of textbooks for schools. And they provide histories of the Revolution, including events like the Boston Massacre is being talked about now, Stamp Act protest, the destruction of the tea is being talked about. It's in this atmosphere that George Hewes is rediscovered when he returns to Boston for a visit. When people find out that he lived through the Boston Tea Party, he becomes this really celebrated hero. They all want to hear about it. And so we see this democratization of the memory of the Revolution. There's a greater celebration of the common soldier. And in fact, in 1818, the soldiers began getting pensions if they served in the Revolution, but only if you could prove that you were destitute and really needed help. But by early 1830s, all veterans start getting pensions from the Revolution. But by then, of course, many of them had passed on. So the attitude of this time is that gratitude should not only go to the elite leaders, your Washingtons and Jeffersons and so on, but to the many common people as well, the men and women. Old veterans are being granted these pensions as people realize that many were poor and destitute and needed their help. Oh, I was going to talk about this earlier. Here's a picture of the Tea Party that was done by Currier and Ives. And when I was a kid, I always liked those little pictures you get in some of the magazines for kids. You had to pick out all the things that were wrong in the picture. Well, you can do that with this picture too. There's a number of things that are wrong with this picture. For example,
beginning with the daylight.
yeah, it's in day. It happened at night, so it's dark. It's December. I don't think these guys would have been shirtless, unless they were Buffalo Bills fans or something. Also, they broke open the boxes of the tea. They show a crowd of people who are all waving their hats and cheering them on. The reality was there were people who watched, but they stood in silence. And also, everybody in this picture is male. So, and there's only 2 ships shown here. There actually were 3. There's a lot of things that are wrong with this picture, but they're just trying to make this look like a safe version of the Boston Tea Party. Oh, by the way, December 2023 will be the 250th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, so if you want to be involved, you better get your tickets now. Here's the monument. This is the Bunker Hill Monument. I was there about 5 years ago. And you can climb right up to the top of it and look out. It's a very narrow staircase. It winds all the way up in a spiral staircase. It's kind of cool. But you got to be in shape a little bit to get up there. But when they built this monument, it was intended by the elites to be, they wanted to kind of control the narrative, but they lost control of it because when they marched out to the monument with the site where they put the cornerstone, all classes of citizens joined in marching out there and participating in this whole ceremony. They wanted to make sure that gratitude went to all the people, the veterans, as well as the elite people. So this conservative and radical memory of the Revolution arises. The conservative memory is that it celebrated the elites of the Revolution and downplayed the violent, radical side of the Revolution. Little was done to commemorate the Stamp Act protest or the Boston Massacre when their 50th anniversaries approached. So that picture I just showed you of the Boston Tea Party, it was a very conservative picture. It looks like it was a very, non-violent, simple protest. And it was very popular because all the people were cheering it on. The radical side of this was the radical memory of the Revolution, celebrated the common people's role in the Revolution and commemorated some of the more radical aspects of the Revolution, like the Sons of Liberty, the Boston Massacre, the Tea Party. They wanted to remember those who had been left out of the story up to that point. And the radical stances of workers' unions and abolitionists kind of contributed to this kind of thinking. Workers celebrated their ideas of liberty and freedom, especially from the factory owners who seemed to control so much of their lives. So Young raises a question: when did they start calling it the Boston Tea Party? It had been known as the destruction of the tea by the generation who lived through it. When did it change? In fact, it wasn't even a celebrated event. It's largely forgotten about. But 50 years after the Revolution, the public memory of the Revolution gets created, imagined, and invented by the generations who had not lived through it. And Young says the name the Tea Party actually came about by the authors who wrote the biographies of Hewes. That's the first time that he could find that anybody ever called this the Tea Party. Hewes was invited to come to Boston as part of the activities to commemorate the 4th of July in 1835, and he was vastly celebrated all over the town. Calling it the Tea Party makes this event seem just less radical and appear very tame. They wanted the British to appear to be the aggressors, not and Americans as defenders of liberty. They were reluctant to celebrate anything that was violent about the revolution. Oops, get ahead of myself here. Hewes dies in 1840 after falling from a carriage as he prepared to go to a July 4th celebration in Richfield Springs. He was just getting into this carriage, and one of the horses bolted, and he fell and hit the pavement. And he died in November of 1840, November 5th. And here we see his gravestone in Richfield Springs. And again, we can play that game where what's wrong with this picture? One, his tombstone says he was 109. He was not. He was actually 98 when he died. He was born in 1742. Also, another interesting thing is the headstone has the date of the Tea Party wrong. They have it happening in 1770. It actually happened in 1773. This book is really a example of the usefulness of microhistory. By focusing on an ordinary person or a minor event, it allows us to challenge more traditional history that emphasizes important actors in history or more important events. And it allows us to see how not everyone fit into patterns of history that we often generalize about, such as the Revolution was not all just about Whig ideology. It provides a different perspective of the Revolution from an ordinary person that we don't normally get. So learning about George Robert 12 Hewes helps us understand the role of working people in the Revolution and what it meant to them. At the end of the book, Young quotes Wendell Phillips, who was an abolitionist, who said, "Revolutions always begin with the populace, never with the leaders. They argue, they resolve, they organize. It is the populace that, like the edge of the cloud, shows the lightning first." And then he concluded his book saying, "Mechanics like Hewes were a presence in framing the political system so that politicians would have to take into account the aspirations of people who refused to take their hats off for anyone. This long struggle to achieve rights, equal rights, and to expand the meaning of liberty in the Liberty Tree is one of the grand themes of American history. We do well to keep it in public memory." This is another plaque that's next to his grave. It also has some facts wrong. I like that on his grave it says something about he was one who helped drown the tea in Boston in 1770, it says in his stone. So here's George Hewes again. So from looking at this picture, like I said, you really can't tell he was a shoemaker. He looks like an ordinary citizen. That's kind of what he wanted to be, and that's how he's depicted in this picture. Whereas Paul Revere, it's very clear what he is in this picture. And I guess that's it. Thank you. I don't know if there's any questions from anybody or anything. Yes, ma'am.
What is your future with a PhD in history? Be a teacher there, maybe?
I'd like to teach, but I like to write as well, so I'll have to do some more writings, and I got more books in my head I'd like to get out. But I hope to do some teaching. Yeah. I'm trying to finish up my dissertation right now. I'm very close. So I'm hoping by the end of this year I will be completely done. Thank God. I get my life back. Yes.
My apologies for coming in a couple of minutes late. I don't know if you said this before I arrived, but do we know approximately what number of colonists participated in the drowning of the T? And what was the local receptiveness to the action? And I mean, it was an act of rebellion. What was?
I don't recall, and he probably says in the book, but I don't remember how many people participated in it altogether. And not all of them were dressed up as Indians either, but it was a rebellious act.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the governor wouldn't call out British troops because he was afraid what would happen.
Sure.
We already had the Boston Massacre. This could be a real bloodbath if they showed up with all these people around trying to stop these guys from doing this. So it was popular among some people, but there were a lot of Tories, like John Malcolm in Boston as well, who would have objected to this.
Yeah, I'm so intrigued by so many things that you said about how, on the one hand, this is a micro look at history. You choose an event and you really focus on that. If you've spent a lot of time studying the larger whole group of events, there's so much that's inconsistent. I mean, to say that, you know, the elitists whose telling of the story, or telling of the reasons and the ultimate story of the American Revolution, their version won out. There were many among them who would have said, oh no, we never meant to defend a Whig ideology. Never, ever. You know, they would never call themselves aristocrats. That's what they were supposedly rebelling against.
Right, right.
You know, of course, they set up an aristocratic system.
Mm-hmm.
You had to be a landowner to have rights.
Yeah. Well, the Constitution is kind of a counter-revolution in a way, because it's a conservative reaction to the revolution. They're trying to suppress some of the more radical side of the revolution.
And I know that
None of it's democracy. You're trying to curtail the effects of that. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
For several years, I was trying to teach the philosophy and use the events to back up, you know, why there was this revolution, whatever. And one of the points that I had to hammer home a lot, I never learned when I was in high school, or never under the impression by the time I left grade school and high school, but didn't learn until I started to dig in post-secondary, is that there never was majority support throughout the colonies for the separation.
No,
Never,
that's true.
Not even close.
Yeah. I mean, people generally put it in thirds. The third wanted
Exactly.
independence, the third
And a third in
sided with British, and there was a third people not really sure what they wanted to do. Kind of sat on the fence.
I don't mean to dominate, but can you say a little more about the tar and feathering? Like, how common a punishment was that?
That was even back in England, that was used to punish
Right.
people. It was called facing the music.
It seems so brutal. I
Yeah,
mean,
it was pretty brutal. I mean, all that tar in your hair, I mean, you had to basically shave your head because you couldn't get it out. And it burned when it went on your skin. It was pretty cruel.
I mean, talk about selective memories. How can you say, well, yeah, we did this and I supported that, but, you know, it wasn't as bad as what they were. Hello?
Yeah, that's why later on they didn't really talk about the tarring and feathering and some of those things. They saw that as just being too radical, too violent.
Crazy.
So we had this revolution to get our independence, but then we kind of had this aversion to revolution afterwards.
Absolutely. They just, for years I've ascribed to the writings that say, you know, we took King George out and put President George in charge of what was essentially the same system replicated here that had been over there, except we tweaked some of the things that we really found reprehensible.
Well, even Andrew Jackson was known as King Andrew the First.
Yeah.
People objected to some of his power. Yes, ma'am.
Do they know about how much tea was dumped?
Oh, I'm sure they did.
I mean, so many bales, was it bales back then?
Well, they were in boxes, wooden boxes. They had to break them open. That's why in the picture I showed you, they were just throwing the boxes overboard. They didn't break them open. That's not what happened. They broke them open and dumped them in. I meant to have a slide in here, I don't know what happened to it, I thought I included it, but every year they reenact the Boston Tea Party.
Oh, I bet.
And so this year, like I said, it'll be the big 250th in December of 2023, but they put out advertising asking people to donate tea. So they can put it in these boxes, these containers, so they can have tea to dump out. They want to go out and buy all that tea. Yes.
Just to clarify, was it just the Sons of Liberty that were involved in this, what I call the Boston Tea Party, or you call the
No.
building of the tea?
No, it was not. There were people who were organized that put this together that showed up, but other people just joined them on their own. So no, it was not just Sons of Liberty, it was other people that just jumped in as well. So like I said, not everybody was dressed up as a Native American. They just joined at the last minute.
Thank
Yeah. Yes.
What was the reason for them to dress up as Indians?
A few reasons. One, to disguise themselves. Two, the image of an Indian usually caused fear among people. And I've read some things that suggested that maybe one reason they chose Indians because they saw Native Americans as really truly free. Because they didn't see them as having a real government, even though they did. That they really lived free. They didn't have a government oppressing them, charging them taxes and stuff. So perhaps that's part of the story as well, I'm not sure.
What made the Shoemaker a hero then? Did he dump a lot of tea himself?
He helped dump tea, but it's just like I said, I think what really made him a hero is he lived so long. So by the 1830s, there aren't too many people around anymore who lived through the Revolution and could tell stories about it. And so they thought he was just the greatest thing because he actually experienced it. He was there at the Boston Massacre and the Tea Party, and he would sing songs for people about, that they sang back then and tell them stories. So they just thought he was the most wonderful person. It must have been. It was pretty cool to actually meet somebody who went through these things. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. That was very interesting. Learned some history here.
Well, that's what we're here for.
Okay, so just a reminder that next Friday, the book review will be same time, same place, and it will be by Maya DeRoche. She wrote a book and will be reviewing it. The title is Forever Chrysalis, and books will be on sale after her book review. So that's next Friday. So hope to see you then.
Thank you. Thank you.